Victorian insertion lace will just always be arrestingly, even hauntingly beautiful. Even modern fashion returns to this idea frequently, likely because it's a technique with infinite possibilities. So join me as I return to this idea for a third time, but this time we'll goth her up a bit. Both in acknowledgement of the spooky season, but also in acknowledgement of the Victorian period's incredible influence on one of the 20th century's most alluring subcultures. This will be the base for a whole look, which will take inspiration from the 17th century, which I would argue, like the Victorian period, took inspiration from the original Gothic period, but more on that later. I'm not saying a goth-influenced garment has to be black, but I started with black cotton voile. My last t-shirt-based insertion lace project went well, and I kind of like the idea of using a standard pattern in materials, and letting variations in the technique, and in this case color, create an entirely different story. That was a long-winded way of saying I used the same t-shirt pattern, although this time I kept it a set-in sleeve. The lace I used was black cotton Nottingham lace, but I didn't have exactly the width I wanted, so I attached 2 scalloped pieces along the scallops. I attached these by hand so that I could perfectly line up the holes in the lace, and because I'm in my element when doing fiddly handwork. I wanted to play with the verticality of stained glass windows, and the generally elongated medieval Gothic silhouette. So I used the doubled piece of lace to connect 2 front panels at center front. As I pointed out in my last insertion lace video, the Victorians had no qualms with leaving the fabric on either side of the lace raw. But it was nice that the center front panels took advantage of the lovely selvedge of the material. I basted this in place before stitching the very edge of the lace on the machine. I completed the back panel in the same way with a slit at the top, and matched the front and back together wrong sides together. I connected the side seams with a French seam. I suppose I could have used a lace on the side seams, but it's an area that sees a lot of wear. I cut the seam allowances from both sides of the shoulder seams so that I could insert lace into the shoulder seam. I stitched the lace over the top of one side of the shoulder seam about 1/4 inch from the edge, and pressed the 1/4 inch seam allowance away from the lace. I stitched just to the side of the original stitch line to keep the seam allowance down. I similarly attached the other side of the shoulder seam. I used a thin 1-inch twill tape as a binding over the back neck slit. I love using sort of unluxurious materials like twill tape alongside the dainty lace. I used a super long twill tape to bind the neck. And allowed the ends to hang free as a tie closure. I continued the vertical theme on the sleeve by arranging 3 lines of lace. I stitched these on top of the cotton voile, and cut the voile between the lines of stitching on each lace piece. I pressed all of the seam allowances away from the lace. I stitched along the edges of all the lace to keep the seam allowances back. Obviously, those ragged lace edges were cut away before I stitched another row of lace horizontally over the bottom edge of the sleeve. I added a panel of cotton bobinette to the bottom of the sleeve. I did not press the seam allowance of the bobinette back, since the bobinette is sheer and the seam allowance is less visible through the lace. I stitched a single layer of the scalloped edging to the bottom of the sleeve. I attached another row of the plain lace to the sleeve cap. Yep, right over the curve of it. I folded the sleeve so that the side seams met with the wrong sides together. I used a French seam to connect them and was very, very careful, especially along the sheer portion. I matched the sleeve cap to the arm side. I very carefully stitched the sleeve cap lace to the arm side. This was not easy, but not as hard as I'd originally feared, just a lot of sewing small awkward links from inside the garment. I decided right about here that I wanted a sheer panel at the bottom of the shirt to echo the sheer panel of the sleeve. So I cut a larger rectangle of the bobinette and attached the lace to the top and the scalloped trim to the bottom. I made a second panel and attached it to the first at the side with a French seam. I laid this against the bottom of the shirt, matching up one side seam. Once the lace was stitched down, I matched up the open side seam and closed it with a French seam. I then stitched over the stitch line that connected the sheer panel to the shirt originally so that the small seam allowance from the new French seam wouldn't weirdly jut out. It's always a pleasure to revisit insertion lace, and I can't wait to show you what we're making to go on top. As I mentioned previously, I'm going to try to have that video out as a sort of bonus video this month, but she's complicated, so we'll see. If you enjoyed this video, I always appreciate a thumbs up, and hit subscribe if you love revisiting the past. Until next time, bye!